It began with a single ring in the middle of the night, a sound that had haunted Mary Kim for 32 years. At exactly 2:17 in the morning, her phone pierced the silence of her small Alabama home. Her trembling hand reached for it, half expecting bad news, half praying it was not another false lead. On the other end, a calm but firm voice spoke. "This is Detective Eliza Sawyer from the Cleburne County Cold Case Unit." Then came the words Mary had dreamed of hearing for over 3 decades. "We got him." 32 years after Elizabeth Kim vanished on a warm spring evening, the ghost of that night had finally been cornered. As Mary struggled to find her breath miles away in a quiet Montgomery neighborhood, flashing blue lights cut through the fog. Unmarked vehicles rolled slowly along a sleeping street. Inside one of the homes, a man who had lived an ordinary, unnoticed life for decades sat upright on his couch. His name was Edward Allen Clean. He looked confused when the door burst open, when officers swarmed in, when the cold metal of handcuffs closed around his wrists. After all these years, he knew it was over. What had this man done to a young woman who had simply gone for a short walk home? How had he managed to live freely among his neighbors, carrying the weight of a secret so dark for so long? If you want to uncover the truth behind these questions, like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and make sure to turn on the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Also, tell me from which city you are watching this cold case story, and let us complete 5,000 likes on this one. The night of September 23, 2021, began like any other. But as the clock struck 2:17, time stopped for one mother and restarted for the memory of her daughter. In Montgomery, the soft hum of police radios filled the air, while sleepy neighbors peeked from behind curtains. They watched in silence as a man who once blended into the rhythm of their lives was led away in handcuffs. The faint sound of the cuffs clicking shut marked the end of his freedom, and the beginning of answers to a mystery that had haunted an entire town. The long wait for justice had finally begun. Cleburne County, Alabama. A small piece of the Deep South, where pine trees whisper in the wind and everyone knows the names on the mailboxes. Life there moved at its own slow rhythm. On Sundays, church bells echoed across the hills. On Friday nights, the local diner filled with laughter, fried catfish, and the hum of old country songs playing from a jukebox that never stopped working. It was the kind of place where you waved to strangers, where a smile from a neighbor felt like family. But beneath that warm and familiar surface, there was a shadow. A silence that stretched back to one evening in May 1990, when 23-year-old Elizabeth Kim vanished while walking only 6 blocks home. She was young, ambitious, kind, and then she was gone. The story of that night never really left the people of Cleburne County. It settled into the soil, into the air, into the hearts of those who still remembered her face from posters fading on telephone poles. Years passed. Children who once joined the search teams grew up and had children of their own. The old courthouse got a fresh coat of paint. The diner that had closed in the 90s reopened with a new name and brighter lights. Cell phones replaced payphones. The world changed around them, but some things never changed. Mary Kim never changed her phone number, afraid to miss the one call that might bring answers. Every year she renewed the same missing person flyer, hoping someone would see something they had missed before. The whispers in town never faded. People would lower their voices when the name Elizabeth came up. They would say someone knows something, and somewhere out there, the man who had taken her walked among them. He shopped at their stores. He nodded politely at the gas station. He lived in the same sunlight as everyone else. The long shadow of that spring evening never left Cleburne County. It stretched through time, quiet but heavy, waiting for the right moment to reveal what it had been hiding. And that moment began with a simple question no one could yet answer. Who was Edward Allen Clean before the night Elizabeth disappeared? Before the mystery and before the silence, there was simply Elizabeth Kim. She was the oldest child of Mary and Robert Kim, the one her younger brother Michael and sister Janet looked up to. The Kim family was known in Cleburne County as honest, hardworking, and close-knit. Mary worked nights at the local hospital, and Robert managed a small repair shop off Main Street. Life in their modest home was simple but full of love. Michael often said that Elizabeth had a way of making everyone feel seen. She was the type of person who remembered your birthday, who brought soup when you were sick, who always smiled first. Michael once described her as the bridge in their family, keeping everyone connected. She was gentle but strong in ways most people did not see. Her laughter filled their home, and her quiet determination inspired everyone around her. Elizabeth loved her small town, but she dreamed bigger. She worked full-time at the First Cleburne Bank, handling loans and customer accounts with precision far beyond her age. Every evening, after her shift ended, she drove to Anniston for night classes at the community college. Her goal was clear: earn her degree and transfer to Auburn University to study business. She had plans, deadlines, and ambition carefully drawn out in her journals. On her dresser sat a small glass jar labeled "College Fund," half filled with crumpled bills and loose change. Above it hung a handmade countdown calendar marked with bright red X's, counting down the days until she could begin a new chapter. Her family still remembers that jar, untouched after she disappeared. Its label faded, but her handwriting still clear. She had no idea that the world she planned so carefully was about to be stolen from her. Somewhere in that same town, someone else had been watching her too. Someone who knew her path, her schedule, her gentle routine. Someone who had already chosen the moment when their paths would cross. In 1990, Cleburne County was the kind of place where life followed the same familiar rhythm day after day. The population was small, barely 15,000, and most folks lived in or around the quiet town of Heflin. It was the county's heartbeat, where Main Street held everything anyone needed. There was the Piggly Wiggly for groceries, the Heflin Grill where locals shared stories over coffee, and the same old barbershop that had stood for generations. People worked hard, looked out for one another, and trusted that nothing bad could ever happen in a town like theirs. For Elizabeth Kim, routine was everything. Her days began before sunrise. She woke to the soft sound of her alarm at 5:45, tied her running shoes, and jogged through the misty streets before most of the town had even stirred. By 7, she was back home, showered, and dressed neatly for work. She arrived at the bank on time every morning, never late, always prepared. Her co-workers admired her quiet discipline and how she never seemed to waste a minute. In the evenings, Elizabeth divided her time between studying for her night classes and catching up with friends. Her closest friend, Sarah Jenkins, once told detectives that Elizabeth kept a small notebook labeled Goals. Every page had careful notes about the future, plans for college, business ideas, places she wanted to visit. Sarah said she had never met anyone so determined to build her own life from the ground up. When it came to relationships, Elizabeth was friendly but private. She had dated a few times, nothing serious, never distracted from what she wanted most: to move forward, to make something of herself. Her mother used to say that Elizabeth's heart was kind but focused, that she was saving her love for the right time and the right person. The last photo ever taken of her was just a few weeks before she vanished. It showed Elizabeth laughing with friends at a concert in Atlanta, her blue eyes bright, her hair caught in the evening light. She looked free, alive, unaware that this simple moment would soon become a memory frozen in time. No one in that crowd, not even Elizabeth herself, could have guessed that someone was already watching her, someone who knew her routine down to the minute, waiting for the perfect night. Tuesday, May 8, 1990. The day began like every other in the Kim household. At 5:45, Elizabeth's small bedside alarm rang softly. She reached over, turned it off, and stretched before tying her running shoes. The air outside was cool and crisp, carrying the smell of pine and damp soil. The streets were still quiet as she jogged through her usual route, the same 6 blocks she always took, waving to the milk truck driver and the paper boy as she passed. By 7:30, she was back home, Cheeks flushed from the run, her hair tied neatly, and her work clothes already laid out on the chair by the dresser. Mary Kim was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, painting golden stripes across the table. Elizabeth joined her mother, pouring orange juice into 2 glasses. Over breakfast, they talked about small things: her night classes, her upcoming exams, and the letter from the bank hinting at a possible raise. Elizabeth smiled as she told her mother she might be able to save enough to start summer classes early. It was one of those rare mornings where everything felt settled, peaceful, normal. At 8:27, she arrived at the First Cleburne Bank, greeting her coworkers with her usual soft smile. The day moved slowly, filled with the familiar rhythm of paperwork and customers. She processed loans, answered calls, and took her lunch break with a book open beside her sandwich. It was just another Tuesday, at least that was how it appeared. Then at 2:13 that afternoon, something unusual happened. The phone at Elizabeth's desk rang. It was a short call. No one heard what was said. She hung up quietly, her face unreadable. Moments later, she approached her supervisor and asked if she could leave early. Her request was approved without question. She gathered her things, smiled politely, and walked out of the bank. No one at that moment realized that this simple action would mark the beginning of a mystery that would grip an entire county for the next 32 years, and as Elizabeth stepped into the warm afternoon sun, no one could have known that someone else was already waiting for her just beyond the familiar streets she trusted so well. By 4:30 that afternoon, Elizabeth finished her shift at the bank. Security footage showed her stepping through the glass doors, sunlight spilling behind her. She paused in the parking lot for a brief chat with a coworker, laughing softly before unlocking her blue 1985 Honda Civic. Nothing about her manner suggested anything unusual. To anyone watching, it looked like the quiet end of an ordinary workday. She arrived home around 4:45. Inside the Kim residence, everything told a story of routine. Her work clothes were hung neatly in the closet. A dinner plate sat on the counter with a half-eaten sandwich beside it. Her favorite mug rested by the sink, a thin ring of coffee still at the bottom. It was the kind of scene that felt lived in, unremarkable. But it would soon become the last trace of normalcy in that house for decades. At 7:13 that evening, the phone rang. It was Lisa Winters, Elizabeth's closest friend. They spoke for about 10 minutes, chatting about their upcoming exam and making plans to review notes together. Lisa mentioned she had just baked cookies and had a fresh pot of coffee ready. Elizabeth agreed to come over. There was laughter in her voice. Nothing sounded hurried or strange. 13 minutes later, at 7:26, Elizabeth called her mother's workplace. Mary was on her hospital shift, so Elizabeth left a short message with the nurse's station. She said she was heading to Lisa's to study and would be home by 10. It was the last message Mary Kim would ever receive from her daughter. At 7:30, Elizabeth left the house wearing jeans, a navy blue Auburn University sweatshirt, and white sneakers. She carried her backpack over one shoulder, packed with textbooks and notes. The route to Lisa's house was familiar. Down Pine Avenue, across Jackson Street, through the small park, and then 3 blocks along Maple Street. It was a path she had walked countless times, even after dark. At approximately 7:40, an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, saw her passing by. Mrs. Simmons had been watering her garden across from the park. She later told police that Elizabeth waved to her, walking at a normal pace, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulder. It was a quiet evening, the kind of night where you could hear crickets between the streetlights. That simple wave, warm and polite, was the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Kim alive, and as the sky darkened over Cleburne County, no one realized that the young woman who had waved goodnight to her neighbor was about to vanish into silence, leaving behind only questions that would echo for nearly 3 decades. At 8:15 that evening, Lisa Winters glanced at the clock. Elizabeth was never late. The walk from Pine Avenue to Maple Street took no more than 15 minutes. Maybe she stopped somewhere along the way, Lisa thought. Still, a quiet unease began to settle in her chest. She picked up the phone and dialed the Kim residence. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. She tried again a few minutes later with the same result. Eventually, she convinced herself Elizabeth must have decided to stay home or gotten caught up with something. She turned back to her notes, but the feeling that something was off refused to fade. Hours passed. At 10:30, Mary Kim pulled into the driveway after her hospital shift. The house was dark except for the porch light Elizabeth always left on. Mary stepped inside and noticed her daughter's shoes neatly by the door, her car still parked outside. She called out her name once, twice, but only silence answered. Then she saw the message left with the nurse's station. Elizabeth had said she was going to Lisa's house and would be back by 10. A tightness formed in Mary's chest. She immediately called Lisa. When Lisa picked up and realized Elizabeth had never arrived, her voice trembled. Both women felt the same sinking dread. Something was wrong. Within minutes, Mary called the Cleburne County Sheriff's Department. At 11:15, Deputy James Tanner arrived at the Kim residence. He was calm, professional, doing his best to reassure a frightened mother. He explained that most adults who went missing for a few hours usually turned up soon after. But as he walked through the small, tidy home, his confidence began to fade. Elizabeth's car was still in the driveway. Her wallet and identification sat on her dresser. Her work uniform was hung neatly in the closet. Only her backpack was missing. Deputy Tanner stepped outside and looked down the quiet street where the streetlights flickered faintly against the trees. Something about the stillness felt wrong. Elizabeth Kim was not the kind of woman who vanished without reason. And as midnight approached, Mary Kim stood on the porch staring down Pine Avenue, whispering her daughter's name into the dark, hoping, praying that somewhere beyond the silence, Elizabeth would answer. By midnight, the quiet calm of Pine Avenue had turned into a blur of flashing lights and uneasy whispers. Deputy Tanner called for backup, and soon patrol cars lined the neighborhood. Officers spread out with flashlights, their beams slicing through the darkness as they retraced the path Elizabeth should have walked. The park was the first place they searched. The swings creaked softly in the night breeze, and the gravel paths were littered with footprints from earlier that evening. But there was no sign of her. No backpack, no phone, no struggle, just silence. As hours passed, the air grew colder. Mary stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching as officers combed through ditches and hedgerows. Every sound made her turn her head, hoping it was Elizabeth calling back. But the night offered no comfort. By 3 in the morning, more deputies joined the search, marking the 6-block route with reflective tape. The park, the alley behind Jackson Street, the small bridge near Maple, they covered every inch. Still, nothing. When dawn broke over Cleburne County, Robert Kim had already driven back from a business trip 2 towns over. The moment he arrived, he joined the searchers, refusing to rest. Neighbors stepped out of their homes, some still in robes, others bringing coffee and flashlights. A sense of dread hung heavy over the town. By sunrise, the news had spread. Elizabeth Kim was missing. Posters were printed and handed out by volunteers. Local radio stations repeated her description every 15 minutes. 23 years old, 5'6", light brown hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing a navy sweatshirt and jeans. The sheriff's department called in additional help from the state police, and within hours, the FBI had been notified. Special Agent Marcus Reynolds arrived by mid-morning. A quiet, sharp-minded investigator who had handled missing persons cases before. He immediately ordered that the 6-block radius where Elizabeth had last been seen be treated as an active crime scene. Yellow tape went up. Evidence markers dotted the park trail. Officers worked in pairs, scanning drains, checking fences, knocking on doors. They knew the first 48 hours were everything. Every minute that passed without a lead made the silence feel heavier. Mary and Robert stood together on their lawn. watching strangers search for their daughter, trying to believe she would come walking up that street any moment. But deep down they could both feel it. The town they thought they knew so well was now holding a secret no one wanted to face. And somewhere, within those 6 quiet blocks, the truth about what happened to Elizabeth Kim was waiting to be found. By the morning of May 10th, the small town of Heflin had turned into the center of a growing search operation. Officers, volunteers, and even high school students joined the effort, spreading through every corner of the 6-block area. The sun had just risen when 2 deputies, walking the park trail for the 3rd time, noticed something wedged between a fallen log and a patch of tall grass near the midpoint of the park. It was a faded blue backpack. The name stitched on the back read E. Kim. The deputies called it in immediately. Within minutes, the area was surrounded by yellow tape, and photographers began documenting every inch of the scene. The backpack appeared untouched, resting beneath a layer of damp leaves as if it had been carefully placed there, not dropped in a struggle. Inside, everything was still in order. Her notebooks were neatly stacked. Her pens were capped. Her textbook had a folded page marking where she last stopped reading. Even her wallet and a few dollars in cash were inside. There was no sign of violence, no torn fabric, no blood, no dirt. It was as though Elizabeth had simply set it down and vanished into thin air. The discovery shifted everything. Sheriff Walter Daniels, a man known for his calm but commanding presence, officially took over the case. Standing before the press that afternoon, he looked directly into the cameras and spoke with firm conviction. He said the department would treat the disappearance of Elizabeth Kim not as a missing person case, but as a probable abduction. He promised the people of Cleburne County that they would find whoever was responsible. By that evening, a temporary command center had been set up at First Baptist Church, only a few blocks from the Kim residence. Inside, folding tables were covered with maps marked with red pins and blue circles. A large whiteboard listed times, sightings, and leads. Photographs of Elizabeth were pinned along one wall, surrounded by notes and phone numbers. A dedicated tip line was opened, and officers began logging every call. No matter how small or strange it sounded, reporters gathered outside the church, the sound of camera shutters mixing with murmured prayers. For the first time, the disappearance of Elizabeth Kim had become more than a local mystery. It had become a case that drew the attention of the entire state. But for Mary and Robert Kim, the discovery of that backpack brought no comfort. It was proof their daughter had been there, but no proof of where she went next. And somewhere beyond the park and the flashing lights, someone was watching the news. Someone who already knew exactly what had happened that night. When the backpack was secured, it was rushed to the Alabama State Crime Lab under strict chain of custody. Detective Roy Simmons, a seasoned investigator with a calm, deliberate way of working, was assigned to lead the forensic review. He had seen his share of missing person cases, but something about this one felt different. It was too neat, too silent, as if whoever had done this had rehearsed every step. Inside the lab, technicians handled the evidence with care. Every zipper, every page, every fiber of fabric was examined under magnification. The focus was on one goal: to find something, anything that could lead them to who had taken Elizabeth. They dusted for prints, searched for fibers, checked for trace soil or pollen. The results came back after hours of testing. Every fingerprint on the backpack belonged to Elizabeth Kim. There were no foreign prints, no partials, no smudges, no accidental marks from another hand. The outside fabric was clean, except for a faint residue consistent with latex or vinyl, a hint that the person who handled it may have been wearing gloves. Detective Simmons leaned over the lab report, reading it twice. To him, it was not just evidence, it was a message. Whoever took her was careful, calculated. Someone who knew how investigations worked and how to leave nothing behind. When he spoke to reporters later that week, his words were measured but firm. He said, "What we are looking at is not a spontaneous act. This is someone methodical, someone who plans, someone who studies people before they strike. Back at the command center, the realization settled heavily over everyone. This was not random. This was someone within reach, someone who blended in perfectly, moving through the same small town where everyone thought they knew each other. And as investigators began building their first list of suspects, one name would soon surface: an ordinary man with no record, no enemies, and no reason to draw suspicion, until the details of his past began to unfold. Detective Roy Simmons knew that cases like this often began with a wide net. Every person who could have crossed Elizabeth's path, every name that had ever come up in county records would have to be examined. The first suspect pool focused on local offenders living within a 5-mile radius. There were 7 registered individuals in total, all with prior offenses ranging from theft to assault. One name stood out: Raymond Walters, a 40-year-old mechanic with a history of harassment charges and a weak alibi for the night of May 8th. Officers placed him under quiet surveillance, watching his movements, checking his phone records, and even questioning his coworkers, but nothing connected him to Elizabeth. His timeline held. His vehicle showed no trace evidence, and neighbors confirmed seeing him at home that night. The lead went cold, and the investigation shifted to the next circle. The second pool examined the men who had known Elizabeth personally: coworkers, friends, classmates, and one ex-boyfriend named Thomas Garrett. He had dated Elizabeth briefly the year before, and when detectives reached him, his nervousness stood out immediately. His initial story was vague, claiming he was home watching television. Later, his timeline changed, first to a visit to his brother's house, then to an evening drive. The inconsistencies raised suspicion, and detectives brought him in for questioning. For hours, they pressed him about his relationship with Elizabeth, about whether he had tried to contact her again. But in the end, there was no physical link. No calls, no DNA, no connection. Just another dead end. By the end of the 3rd week, detectives expanded their scope to transient workers who had passed through Cleburne County that spring. A traveling carnival had stopped in nearby Anniston during the same week Elizabeth disappeared. Hundreds of staff, vendors, and laborers moved through the area, many without permanent addresses. The FBI and local deputies interviewed dozens of them, chasing leads across 3 counties. Every name led to another trail, another story, another person who remembered nothing unusual. Each interview ended the same way, with polite cooperation and no new answers. Weeks of long nights and empty reports followed. The tip line that once rang every few minutes began to fall silent. Evidence boards filled with red strings and photographs stayed frozen in the same pattern, unmoving, unchanged. And while the investigation seemed to stall, one quiet truth lingered in the background. Someone in Cleburne County knew exactly what had happened, and they had managed to stay invisible. As days turned into weeks, the quiet town of Heflin transformed into a community united by one purpose: finding Elizabeth Kim. The search radius expanded from 6 blocks to 10 miles, covering forests, creeks, and open fields. Volunteers gathered at dawn, forming long lines that stretched across the countryside, walking shoulder to shoulder with officers, hoping to find something that had been missed. Divers entered the murky waters of nearby ponds, probing the depths for any sign of evidence. Riders on horseback combed the trails beyond the park, moving through thick brush and uneven ground. Farmers offered their land for searching, and local pilots volunteered small planes to scan from above. Every hill, every barn, every back road was marked on the growing maps inside the command center. The story began spreading beyond Cleburne County. News anchors in Alabama and neighboring Georgia covered the disappearance with growing urgency. Newspapers ran her photo daily, describing her as a kind young woman with an unshakable spirit. A local radio host started each morning by repeating her name, saying someone out there knew the truth. The community poured its heart into helping. Donations arrived from churches, schools, and strangers who had never met the Kim family but felt connected to their pain. The reward fund grew, first to $5,000, then $10,000, and soon over 20,000, offered by those who still believed a single tip could break the silence. By late summer, the command center looked like a war room of unanswered questions. Hundreds of tips had been logged and followed, more than 200 interviews conducted, dozens of warrants served. Every possible lead was tested and crossed out. The evidence board grew dense with paper and string, but every thread led to another dead end. Only 2 pieces of potential evidence surfaced: a partial footprint found near the far edge of the park trail, and several cigarette butts discovered close to the creek bank. The lab confirmed the footprint matched the same size and brand of shoe Elizabeth wore. The cigarette butts, however, led nowhere. None contained her DNA, and none connected to anyone in the system. The town that once felt safe now moved under a shadow of quiet fear. Parents kept their children close. Neighbors watched strangers more carefully, and every night as Mary Kim sat by her window she stared toward the park, whispering the same question that haunted every heart in Heflin. Where had her daughter gone between those 2 streetlights, and who had been waiting there in the dark? By September of 1990, the search that had once filled every corner of Cleburne County began to lose its noise. The summer heat had faded, and with it, the constant movement of volunteers and media vans. The FBI, after months of coordination, quietly scaled back its involvement. Reports were handed over, leads summarized, and agents reassigned to new cases. The once bustling command center inside First Baptist Church, once alive with phone calls and map updates, now stood nearly empty. Folding tables were cleared, walls stripped of their photographs, and the tip line that had rung day and night was finally shut down. For the Kim family, it felt like the world was moving on without answers. But inside the sheriff's office, one man refused to step away. Sheriff Walter Daniels made the decision to keep Detective Roy Simmons on the case exclusively. Even as other investigators were reassigned to new duties, Simmons worked in silence long after others stopped. His desk stayed covered in files, timelines, and weathered photographs of Elizabeth Kim. He drove the route she had taken dozens of times, stopping at the park bench where she was last seen. He studied the same patch of road, the same trees, the same quiet path that had swallowed her without a sound. He believed she was not lost to the wilderness or taken by chance. Someone in that town had seen something and was still keeping it buried. In December of that year, 6 months after the disappearance, Simmons spoke briefly to a local reporter. His words were steady but heavy with conviction. He said, "Somewhere out there is a person who knows exactly what happened. Maybe they think it does not matter anymore, but it does, and one day, they will speak." Winter settled over Cleburne County and the case faded from the headlines. But for the people who loved Elizabeth and for the detective who carried her file home night after night, the silence did not mean surrender. It meant waiting, watching, hoping for the one sign that could bring everything back to light. And far from the sheriff's office, beyond the quiet streets and sleeping homes, a single secret was still being kept, one that would take decades to surface. May 8, 1991. 1 year to the day since Elizabeth Kim disappeared, the people of Cleburne County gathered in the small park where she was last seen. The air was cool and still, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel heavier. More than 100 people stood together, each holding a candle that flickered gently in the spring wind. White balloons, one for every month she had been gone, swayed above the crowd. Mary Kim stood near the front, her hands trembling slightly as she held her candle close. She looked thinner than before, her face lined with quiet exhaustion, but her voice carried steady through the microphone. She thanked the town for standing by her family, thanked those who still searched, still prayed, still remembered. Then she said something that settled deep into the hearts of everyone there. She said, "The truth always finds its way to the light, no matter how long the night lasts." As the final prayer ended, the crowd released their balloons into the sky. For a moment, the pale dots of white rose against the fading orange light of evening. Some people cried. Others just stood in silence, watching the balloons drift higher until they vanished beyond the trees. Back at the sheriff's office, the tone had changed. The urgency of the first months had given way to the discipline of a long investigation. Sheriff Walter Daniels added a dedicated budget line for the ongoing case, the first time the department had formally recognized that Elizabeth Kim's disappearance would not be solved quickly. Detective Roy Simmons continued his work, reorganizing files, cross-referencing witness notes, and maintaining a small corner of the office devoted solely to Elizabeth's case. He told the team that cases like this did not die from lack of clues, they died from lack of patience. And he was not going to let that happen. As the candles burned low that night and the last search maps were folded away, one quiet truth remained. The case of Elizabeth Kim had become more than an investigation. It had become a promise. And while most of the town tried to move forward, one man still living among them carried a secret that was beginning to crack under the weight of passing years. By the mid-1990s, 5 long years had passed since Elizabeth Kim vanished. Yet for her family, time had not moved forward at all. The world outside kept changing, new buildings, new faces, new stories. But inside the Kim household, everything remained frozen in the moment she disappeared. Mary often described it as living in limbo, caught between hope and heartbreak. In an interview from 1995, she said it was like waking up every morning in the same storm, never knowing if the sun would ever break through again. She kept Elizabeth's room exactly as it had been, the bed made neatly, the posters still on the walls, her books lined up on the shelf in order of size. Even the small glass jar labeled college fund still sat on the dresser, the faded handwriting a reminder of plans that were never fulfilled. Robert Kim could not bear the stillness. After retiring early from his repair business, he began working privately as an investigator, chasing rumors, following cold tips, calling every contact he could find. What began as determination slowly turned into obsession. He traveled across counties, visited prisons, and sat through long nights reading reports over and over. The strain began to wear on both of them. Eventually, the couple decided to live in separate homes, not because of anger, but because grief had taken up too much space between them. They never divorced, holding on to a quiet bond that no distance could erase. Their son, Michael, left Alabama and moved to California, hoping to build a new life far from the shadow that hung over the town. Their daughter, Janet, chose to stay. She married, settled nearby, and when her first child was born, she named the baby girl Elizabeth. It was her way of keeping her sister's name alive, a symbol that something good could still grow out of pain. Every May 8th, the family and the town still gathered at the park. The annual Remembrance Walk became tradition. Candles, prayers, white balloons, each year a little smaller in attendance but never forgotten. Television crews from national crime shows occasionally returned, promising new attention, new technology, new hope. But each time the lights faded, and no new answers followed. For the Kim family, the years stretched endlessly, their lives quietly divided between what had been and what had been lost. And somewhere in those same quiet Alabama hills, the man who had caused their suffering still lived among them, aging, blending, and carrying a secret that was beginning to stir again after decades of silence. By the early 2000s, Cleburne County no longer looked like the small, tightly knit town it once was. The factory on Route 46 had shut down, the old diner changed ownership twice, and younger families had begun moving away in search of better jobs. The streets felt quieter and the town's rhythm slowed to a tired pulse. Even the first Cleburne Bank, where Elizabeth once worked, was sold to a larger chain before finally closing its doors for good. The park where she was last seen had changed too. The old gravel path was repaved, new benches were installed, and bright floodlights now lit the corners that once sat in shadow. Families returned on weekends. Children played where search parties once walked with flashlights, And for many of the newer residents, the story of the missing young woman was just another piece of local folklore. But for those who remembered, the park still carried a heaviness that no renovation could erase. In 2001, a new generation of investigators began to take shape inside the Cleburne County Sheriff's Department. Among them was Detective Laura Moss, a sharp, methodical officer who had grown up hearing whispers about the Elizabeth Kim case. When she joined the department, one of her first priorities was modernizing the way cold cases were handled. She started by digitizing the old files, box after box of handwritten notes, photographs and taped interviews from the 1990s. Each page was scanned, categorized, and uploaded into a searchable database. She began mapping Elizabeth's final movements using early computer modeling, creating visual overlays of her known path, time estimates, and sighting locations. Detective Moss believed that time was not the enemy of a cold case, it was a tool. Technology changed. People aged. Memories softened. But evidence, she said, never truly disappeared. Her philosophy was simple. A cold case is not dead. It is only waiting for the right piece of information or the right tool to bring it back to life. And while the county moved on with new roads, new stores, and new faces, inside a small office lined with glowing monitors, the story of Elizabeth Kim quietly began to breathe again, waiting for the moment when the past would finally collide with the present. By the early 2010s, science had caught up to what Hope had been trying to do for years: bring the truth closer. With new DNA technology reshaping forensic work across the country, Detective Laura Moss ordered every piece of evidence from the Elizabeth Kim case to be re-examined. The backpack, the clothing fibers, the cigarette butts, even the soil samples collected from the park, all were sent to the state lab once again, this time under far more advanced testing methods than those available decades before. Technicians handled each sample with precision. Some materials were too degraded to yield results, but the careful preservation done back in 1990 had paid off. A few fragments were found intact, allowing them to be entered into the expanding national DNA databases. It was a waiting game now. If the system ever matched that unknown genetic trace to someone, the past could finally speak. Detective Moss made one critical decision. She would preserve every remaining piece of evidence indefinitely. She said it was not a question of if technology would solve this case, but when. Then came the loss no one expected. In 2012, Robert Kim suffered a sudden heart attack while on a short trip to Georgia. He had been chasing a lead. Just one more interview, one more chance to find closure. The news broke quietly, and his funeral was small but filled with people who remembered his tireless devotion. At the front of the service beside his photograph rested something unusual, a single brown case file. It was Elizabeth's. The sight of that folder beside his casket said everything words could not. His search had ended, but the mission he carried would not. After his death, Mary Kim stepped forward once more, older now, but still steady in purpose. With the help of her children, she built a website and social media pages dedicated to Elizabeth's story. She uploaded photos, timelines, and old news clippings, urging the public to share them again and again. Her message was simple, repeated in every post, on every flyer, every broadcast she gave. Someone knows something. And as that message spread beyond Alabama, it reached new eyes, one of them belonging to a woman who would soon change everything the investigators thought they knew about that night. If you believe every story deserves to be told, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Your support helps keep these forgotten voices alive. By 2019, nearly 3 decades had passed since Elizabeth Kim disappeared. The old case files sat in quiet drawers, their pages yellowing but still whispering the same unanswered questions. That year, a new sheriff, Marcus Wade, stood before the county commissioners with a simple but powerful request. He wanted to form a small permanent cold case unit, one that would breathe life back into the investigations time had left behind. He spoke about families who still left porch lights on, about mothers like Mary Kim who refused to stop searching, and about how modern technology could now uncover what the old tools never could. His proposal was modest, just 2 full-time investigators, a small budget, and a single converted storage room inside the sheriff's department. After weeks of debate, the motion passed. And from that moment, the Cleburne County Cold Case Unit was born. Detective Eliza Sawyer was chosen to lead it. Known for her precision and relentless patience, she was the kind of investigator who could spend hours on a single photograph, finding meaning in what others overlooked. Alongside her came James Martinez, a younger specialist with expertise in forensic genealogy and digital data recovery. Together they represented 2 generations of investigation, one built on experience, the other on innovation. Their new office was nothing more than an old evidence storage room. It smelled faintly of paper and dust, but within days the walls filled with photos, maps, and timelines. Case binders stacked high on the shelves, each one marked with a name and a date. When it came time to choose their first priority file, the decision was unanimous. The Elizabeth Kim case had survived the years with its evidence carefully preserved, its timeline well documented, and its mystery still intact. Detective Sawyer stood in front of the whiteboard, a black marker in her hand, and wrote a single line at the top. Elizabeth Kim, May 8, 1990. She circled it once. Then she said quietly, "Let us start where everything stopped." And as she spoke those words, no one in that small room could have imagined what the new analysis would soon uncover, something buried deep within the evidence that no one had ever noticed before. Detective Eliza Sawyer and James Martinez began their work with one rule: start from zero, trust nothing that was assumed before. They opened every file, every report, every faded photograph, and began the slow process of rebuilding the case from the ground up. The first months were all about structure. James created a digital database, turning thousands of handwritten notes and evidence tags into searchable data. Every person mentioned, every timestamp, every location was connected through network mapping software. Slowly, a digital web began to form, showing how everyone in Elizabeth's world was linked in ways no one had ever fully seen before. The physical evidence came next. They re-examined the plaster cast footprint found near the park, this time using 3D imaging to measure gait, depth, and stride angle. The analysis suggested something subtle: a heavier step on the right side, possibly a limp or an uneven leg length. A clue that had been missed in 1990 now hinted at the kind of person who might have followed her that night. Then came the cigarette butts, still sealed in evidence tubes after all these years. Advanced chemical tests determined that 2 brands were present, one domestic, one imported, and that at least one had been smoked by a male with O-positive blood type. But DNA extraction proved unreliable after so many decades. Still, it was not the cigarettes that captured Detective Sawyer's attention. It was something smaller. Inside the evidence file marked backpack, a lab tech had noted a single fine hair, stuck deep between the lining and zipper seam. It had been preserved, but never fully tested with modern methods. Sawyer ordered it rushed to Dr. Vanessa Chen at the State Forensics Division, one of the most respected experts in mitochondrial DNA analysis. Dr. Chen explained the challenge. Nuclear DNA, the type that can give a unique genetic fingerprint, was too degraded. Only mitochondrial DNA, passed down through maternal lines, could be recovered. It could not name a person, but it could narrow possibilities, often to a single family. Early in 2020, the test began. The sample was cleaned, extracted, and placed under magnification. Hours turned into days. When the call finally came, Sawyer answered with cautious hope. The result was inconclusive. The sequence was partial, fragmented almost, but not completely readable. It was a setback, but not a defeat. Because even from that broken strand, one line of genetic code appeared clear enough to suggest a pattern that, once cross-checked with one old database, would reveal something no one had ever noticed before. The winter of 2021 brought something that the Cleburne County Cold Case Unit had not felt in a long time. Hope that came from science. Detective Eliza Sawyer received a memo from the FBI about a new partnership with a private genetics laboratory in Virginia. The lab had developed an experimental method that could extract nuclear DNA from hair samples without a root. It used a process called protein-based hair genotyping, a fusion of chemical sequencing and microstructure analysis that could read the unique biological code trapped within the hair shaft itself. For Sawyer, that meant one thing. The hair from Elizabeth Kim's backpack could finally speak. She submitted a detailed application outlining the case history, the preservation quality, and the relevance of the evidence. Weeks passed with silence, then one March morning an email arrived with the word she had been waiting for. Accepted. Within days, the fragile evidence was prepared for transfer. Chain of custody forms were signed, sealed, and escorted to the airport under FBI supervision. It felt almost ceremonial. A single transparent vial containing a single strand of hair was now en route to a laboratory that promised what had once been impossible, the potential of a full nuclear DNA profile after 31 years. The lab estimated an 8-week turnaround. While they waited, Sawyer and Martinez refused to waste a single day. They built a new timeline, not just of Elizabeth's movements, but of every person who had lived, worked, or passed through Heflin in the spring of 1990. They mapped roads, traffic routes, and work shifts. They layered historical census data with GPS reconstruction, building what they called the geographic echo, a pattern of human motion that might point back to one consistent area where the suspect could have lived or worked. Every late night at the cold case office ended the same way. Sawyer standing before the board, staring at Elizabeth's photograph under the dim light, whispering that it was only a matter of time now. Because if the lab's new technology worked, it would no longer be just a case file or a mystery. It would have a name, a face, and a truth that had waited 3 decades to surface. And somewhere in Alabama, that truth was about to find the man who thought he had escaped it on the morning of June 17th. 2021 Detective Eliza Sawyer sat at her desk when her computer chimed with a secure email from the lab. Her hands paused over the keyboard. For a moment, she just stared at the subject line. DNA profile successfully generated. After 31 years, they finally had it. A complete nuclear DNA profile extracted from that single strand of hair. The report confirmed what no one had dared to hope. The sequence was clear, strong, and suitable for both the National CODIS database and forensic genealogy. For Sawyer and Martinez, it felt like breathing air after being underwater for too long. They entered the data carefully, checked every reference code, and initiated the automated CODIS comparison. Every sample in every state and federal file would now be checked against this single genetic fingerprint. Then came the wait. Hours passed. The screen blinked, then froze. Sawyer leaned forward, her breath held. The message finally appeared. No direct offender match. Silence filled the room. Years of work had led to this moment, and yet the system returned nothing. No known criminal in the National Registry shared the DNA found on Elizabeth's backpack. It was both progress and heartbreak. They had a full genetic profile, but no name to match it. That evening, Sawyer sat in the dim light of the cold case office, the printout before her. She traced the pattern of letters and numbers across the page. This was their man. They had his identity coded in sequence, but he had never been caught. Never been entered into the system. The next morning, she called in a specialist, Carolyn Fitzpatrick, an expert in investigative genetic genealogy, who had worked with the FBI on multiple cold cases across the country. Carolyn's work was part science, part patience, part art. By using public genealogy databases, she could trace familial connections, second cousins, great-grandparents, or distant relatives, to slowly close in on the suspect's lineage. She listened carefully to the summary, then said quietly that this one felt solvable. The DNA was clear enough. The region small enough, the records preserved. All they needed was time. As Sawyer ended the call, she looked again at Elizabeth's photo on the wall. For the first time, she felt the distance between past and present begin to close, because now science had given the killer a voice he could not silence. And soon, that voice would lead them straight to a man who had been living freely, just miles away, thinking the world had forgotten. From that moment, the investigation became a journey through bloodlines and forgotten names. Carolyn Fitzpatrick began her work by uploading the DNA profile to public genealogy databases, carefully comparing genetic markers against millions of entries. At first, the connections were faint, distant cousins, weak overlaps, fragments of shared ancestry. But slowly, through a process called triangulation, the picture began to sharpen. Each match was a small light on the screen, and together they began to form clusters, family lines that reached deep into the heart of Alabama. Carolyn built what investigators called a reverse family tree, starting from unknown descendants in the present and tracing backward toward the person whose DNA had been found on Elizabeth's backpack. By August of 2021, after weeks of cross-referencing public records, birth certificates, obituaries, and marriage licenses, one particular family name kept appearing, an Alabama family with roots in Cleburne County and generations of sons who had lived within 20 miles of Heflin in the early 1990s. Detective Sawyer and Martinez began field interviews, quietly approaching relatives, explaining the purpose of the genetic genealogy investigation, and requesting voluntary DNA swabs. Most agreed without hesitation, wanting to help the case that had haunted their community for decades. Each new sample added another branch to the tree and another elimination. Then came the breakthrough. A woman in her late 60s agreed to participate after learning her late cousin had once lived near Maple Street, where Elizabeth was last seen. When her swab was processed, the results drew a near-perfect genetic overlap, placing the unknown DNA as belonging to her second cousin, twice removed. That one connection narrowed the family tree to a single surviving branch. From there, the pattern was unmistakable. Only one male descendant fit the age, the location, and the inherited markers that matched the DNA profile. He was alive, still living in Alabama, still hiding behind a quiet life built on 3 decades of distance. And when Detective Sawyer read his name for the first time, she understood why this case had remained unsolved for so long, because sometimes evil learns to blend perfectly into ordinary life. It was a humid morning on September 3rd, 2021, when Detective Eliza Sawyer printed the name that would change everything. The ink smudged slightly as she ran her finger under it, whispering each word aloud. Edward Allen Clean, age 61. Born and raised in Alabama, a quiet man who now lived outside Montgomery. The genealogy charts, the voluntary DNA swabs, the mapped family tree, all pointed directly to him. Every branch, every genetic thread ended at that single name. When Sawyer searched through the original case files from 1990, her eyes narrowed. Clean's name was nowhere, not one mention. He had never been questioned, never even listed among the hundreds of interviews that filled those early months. On paper, he did not exist in the investigation at all. Martinez began compiling what he called a life profile, piecing together who Edward Clean had been when Elizabeth vanished. The records revealed that in 1990, he worked as a delivery driver for a regional supply company. His routes included several small stores around Heflin, including one near the Piggly Wiggly, just blocks from the park where Elizabeth was last seen. He had no criminal record, no violent background, no known complaints, just a man who worked quietly, paid his bills, and moved out of Cleburne County a few months after Elizabeth's disappearance. From there, his life seemed almost unremarkable. Steady jobs, a modest home, and a long stretch of years that left no trace of suspicion. That was what made him dangerous. Sawyer once said that the most frightening suspects were not the ones who stood out, they were The ones who never gave you a reason to look twice. And Edward Clean had built a life around blending in. Ordinary enough to disappear in plain sight. But the DNA said otherwise. The science had no bias, no memory to fade. It simply pointed at the truth. Sawyer placed Clean's photo on the investigation board, drawing a red circle around his face. She stared at it in silence. There was something chilling about how ordinary he looked. A man you might pass in a grocery aisle or wave to at a gas station. And yet, that same man was about to face the consequences of a night he thought the world had long forgotten. Once the name Edward Allen Clean appeared on that whiteboard, the air in the cold case office seemed to change. The evidence had spoken, but Eliza Sawyer knew that before she could move, she needed one last piece of undeniable proof. A direct DNA match. The plan was simple, but it had to be perfect. They would collect a fresh DNA sample from Cleany without his knowledge, using what investigators called a discarded DNA recovery. Anything he touched, anything he threw away, could become the final link that tied him to Elizabeth Kim's case. For the next 2 weeks, Sawyer and Martinez set up discreet surveillance near Clean's home outside Montgomery. From a parked sedan down the street, they watched his quiet daily routine. Early morning walks, grocery runs, coffee at a small diner. Always alone, always predictable. Then on the evening of September 21st, the break they had waited for came. Clean stopped at a gas station, bought a soda, drank it in his truck, and tossed the empty can into a roadside bin. Within seconds of his departure, the can was recovered, carefully bagged, labeled, and sent directly to the state crime lab under FBI escort. The lab technicians worked through the night. It was early morning, September 23rd, when Sawyer's phone rang. The clock beside her bed read 2:17 a.m., the same time that would one day become legend inside the unit. The analyst's voice was calm but carried the weight of 31 years of silence ending all at once. The DNA profile from the soda can was a perfect match to the genetic profile from the hair found in Elizabeth Kim's backpack. The probability of a random match was calculated at less than 1 in 900 trillion. For a long moment, Sawyer said nothing. She just sat there in the dark, her hand trembling around the phone, knowing that after all these years they finally had him. Within the hour, she called Sheriff Wade and authorized the tactical mobilization. Then before dawn, she made one more call, to Mary Kim. The woman who had waited 3 decades for justice answered in a quiet voice. Sawyer told her that they had found him, that the man who took Elizabeth's life was alive and he would face what he had done. Mary did not speak right away. When she did, her voice cracked with both relief and exhaustion. She simply said, "Thank you for not giving up on her." Outside, the night was still, but in that silence, a 31-year chase had finally reached its end, and the man who thought he had escaped justice was about to hear the knock that would end his freedom forever. When the warrant came through and the world finally learned the name Edward Allen Clean, people expected to see a monster. But what they saw instead was a man who could have been anyone. A man whose face would not turn a single head in a crowd. 61 years old, average height, thinning gray hair, soft voice, polite manners. The kind of neighbor who waved from his porch and returned your lawnmower on time. Reporters gathered outside his quiet Montgomery neighborhood, asking those who knew him for years to describe the man now accused of murder. They spoke carefully, almost in disbelief. A private man once said, polite, never caused trouble. He mowed his own yard. He brought casseroles to church events. The background check revealed nothing remarkable. Clean was born in Gadsden, Alabama. His school records showed average grades, nothing to suggest aggression or instability. After a short, incomplete stint at community college, he joined a local beverage distribution company, where he worked as a delivery driver throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. That job quietly placed him across multiple small towns, including Heflin. He made deliveries to local groceries, gas stations, and even the small diner Elizabeth Kim used to visit. He would have known the layout of the area, the park, the quiet side streets. In May of 1990, he had access to nearly every location Elizabeth passed through on her last walk. Then, near the end of that same year, Clean relocated to Montgomery. The timing was precise, just months after Elizabeth's disappearance. It was filed as a routine company transfer, but it now looked like something else. A quiet escape. In his later life, Clean seemed to perfect the image of normalcy. He married through a church singles group, though the marriage remained childless. He earned small promotions at work, joined the Rotary Club, and maintained a spotless public record. To anyone who met him, he was respectable, responsible, and ordinary. But beneath that calm exterior was the truth of a man who had built an entire life on the hope that no one would ever connect him to a single spring evening in 1990, and now that mask of ordinary life was beginning to crack, because the evidence he left behind 31 years ago was about to speak louder than the quiet life he built to cover it. For weeks, Detective Eliza Sawyer searched for the missing link. How had Edward Allen Clean crossed paths with Elizabeth Kim? There were no shared schools, no overlapping church records, no social connections, and no family ties. They lived in the same region, yes, but their worlds should never have touched. Yet something in Sawyer's gut refused to believe it was random. She and Martinez began to re-examine the original files once again, this time with microscopic attention. They pulled bank records, time cards, and payroll transfers, retracing Elizabeth's professional life in the weeks leading to her disappearance. It was during one of those late nights, under the pale light of the cold case office, that Martinez noticed a small notation in an old payroll log. 2 weeks before the night Elizabeth vanished, a check had been cashed at her branch from the beverage company where Clean worked in 1990. The teller's initials written in the corner matched hers, E.K. The next morning, Sawyer located the old security film records that had been digitized years earlier. The footage was grainy, the timestamp faint, but it showed exactly what they needed. A man in a delivery uniform stood at Elizabeth's window, handing over a check. He smiled as she processed it. She handed it back. It was a simple transaction, lasting no more than 2 minutes. But that brief encounter might have changed everything. Perhaps he noticed her kindness, her professionalism. Perhaps it was the way she smiled, unaware that someone on the other side of the counter had already decided she would not be forgotten. It was the first and only recorded moment where their lives intersected, and it was enough. From that day, Clean would have known her face, her schedule, and the fact that she often walked home. The pieces fit too precisely to be coincidence. Sawyer stared at the still frame of the video, the young woman at her counter, the man standing across from her, and the date stamped at the bottom. It was 2 weeks before everything changed, and now, that single frame had become the bridge between two lives, one cut short and one that had hidden in plain sight for 31 years. Once the final link was confirmed and the evidence locked into place, the focus shifted from discovery to precision. Every step from that point forward had to be flawless. After 31 years, one mistake, one procedural error could unravel everything. Detective Eliza Sawyer convened a multi-jurisdictional task force that included local deputies, the FBI field office, and the Montgomery Police Department. The atmosphere inside the operations room was tense but controlled. Maps were pinned across the wall. Photos of Edward Allen Clean's house, vehicles, and routine were marked with colored pins. Every possible scenario was discussed: entry points, timing, and fallback communication lines. The district attorney, Caroline Winters, joined the operation herself. Calm and meticulous, she reviewed the entire chain of evidence with the same focus as Sawyer. Together they prepared the warrants. One for Clean's residence, one for his 2 vehicles, another for a small storage unit he rented outside the city. The scope was wide, covering digital devices, personal papers, and what investigators called possible trophies, items offenders sometimes keep from their victims. Sawyer stood before the team and reminded them of the stakes. 31 years of work, hundreds of interviews, and one family that had carried the weight of silence all this time. This was not a moment for triumph. It was a moment for accuracy. The approach was decided carefully. Clean lived in a quiet cul-de-sac, with neighbors close enough to notice any commotion. A daytime arrest risked interference or chaos, so they chose the safest and most controlled moment possible, a pre-dawn operation. At 4:30 a.m., the tactical teams began assembling in the darkness. The air was thick and still, the kind of silence that amplifies every sound. Sawyer arrived last, her jacket pulled tight against the cool air. Her eyes locked on the dim glow of the suspect's porch light in the distance. Every officer in that moment knew this was the end of something that began long before most of them were even in uniform. Because within that quiet Alabama neighborhood, behind a simple brick wall and white curtain, slept a man who believed he had buried the truth forever. And the knock that was coming for him before sunrise would change everything he had built his life upon. The morning of September 23, 2021, broke in silence. The neighborhood near Montgomery was still dark when unmarked vehicles rolled into position along the quiet suburban street. Headlights cut briefly through the mist before switching off one by one. Inside those cars sat a coordinated team, state officers, federal agents, and detectives who had lived and breathed this case for years. At 5:10 a.m., Detective Eliza Sawyer gave the signal. Radios clicked softly. Officers moved into place. A faint light glowed through the curtains of Edward Allen Clean's modest brick home. He was awake earlier than expected. 5 minutes later, the team approached the front door. The lead agent knocked firmly, voice steady, as he announced law enforcement presence and the execution of a warrant. The sound echoed through the stillness of dawn. For a long few seconds, nothing happened. Then footsteps, the door opened. Clean stood in the frame wearing a gray t-shirt and glasses. His face was calm, confused perhaps, but not afraid. He blinked at the sight of the tactical vests and badges before him. Detective Sawyer stepped forward. Her voice was clear and even. She informed him that he was under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Elizabeth Kim, committed on May 8, 1990. For the first time, Clean's face shifted. His lips parted slightly, his shoulders tensed, but he said nothing. No denial, no protest, no question. He simply nodded once and held out his wrists. And in that moment, one detail struck everyone in the room. He never asked who Elizabeth was. As officers led him away, Sawyer and the search team entered the home. It was orderly, almost sterile. Every item seemed placed with purpose. In a small study behind a locked metal cabinet, they found something chilling. A collection of old newspapers folded neatly, yellowed with age. Each one dated between May and June of 1990. Every headline about the disappearance of Elizabeth Kim. He had kept them all. Hidden but preserved, as if he needed to remember the moment he had outsmarted the world. Sawyer stood in that quiet room, her flashlight beam sliding across the clippings. For 31 years, this man had lived an unremarkable life while holding on to his secret trophy, the memory of a young woman who never came home. And though the arrest had gone exactly as planned, everyone there understood one thing clearly. The hardest part was not taking him in. It was what they might find once they began to search deeper into the places he had kept locked away. By mid-morning, the news had already swept across town like wildfire. Every local station carried the same breaking headline: the arrest made in the 31-year-old case of Elizabeth Kim. The name Edward Allen Clean appeared on every screen, and with it disbelief rippled through the community. Neighbors stared at their televisions, recognizing the man who had waved politely during his morning walks, the quiet delivery driver who never raised his voice. To them he had been ordinary, unremarkable, safe. And now, the thought that he might have taken Elizabeth's life all those years ago felt like a betrayal buried deep in the town's heart. Mary Kim's phone began to ring just after 7 a.m. Reporters, friends and former volunteers all reaching out. When she finally stepped before the cameras outside her home, her voice trembled but her eyes were steady. She said that justice might move slowly, but truth always finds its way to light, and that today, her daughter's name was finally being spoken not in mystery, but in memory. By noon, people began gathering at the park where Elizabeth's candlelight vigils had once been held. Flowers lined the walking path. White candles flickered in the breeze. Some of Elizabeth's former classmates stood together, now adults with children of their own. They spoke quietly, recalling her laughter, her kindness, and the innocence of those days before fear had taken root in their small town. Local teacher Lisa Winters, who had been in high school when Elizabeth vanished, told a reporter how the case had changed everything for a generation of parents. How, after that spring of 1990, children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. How it had become the story every family told when teaching safety, trust, and caution. Now, standing among the candles, she looked at the faces of younger parents and said softly that the shadow which had haunted their town for decades might finally be lifting. But as night fell, and the crowd slowly thinned, a quiet unease lingered in the air. Because even with an arrest, questions remained. What had really happened in those final hours, and how had a man like Edward Clean managed to carry that secret for so long without anyone seeing who he truly was? The morning after the arrest, the courthouse in Montgomery was overflowing. Reporters lined the hallway. Camera flashes painted the walls in bursts of white. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the man who had once blended so easily into the crowd. At precisely 9 a.m., the monitor inside courtroom 2 flickered to life. Edward Allen Clean appeared on screen from the county detention center. He sat still, wearing the plain orange uniform of a detainee, his eyes fixed on the floor. No family sat in the benches behind him. No one came to speak on his behalf. Judge William Barnett presided over the hearing, his voice steady as he read through the charges: kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and first-degree murder. Each word echoed through the room. Clean looked up briefly, but his face remained unreadable, as if the weight of it all had not yet reached him. When the question of bail arose, the courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor stood and argued that the evidence was overwhelming, that the suspect had evaded justice for more than 3 decades, and that the nature of the crime warranted full detention. Judge Barnett agreed. His ruling was firm. No bail granted. Across town, Mary Kim watched the hearing from home, her hands clasped tightly together. For the first time in 31 years, she felt the system was finally moving in her daughter's name. The man who had stolen Elizabeth's life was no longer free to walk among them. After the hearing, District Attorney Caroline Winters faced the press. Her statement was brief but resolute. She announced the state's intent to pursue first-degree murder charges despite the passage of time, emphasizing that justice has no expiration date. The words carried through the courthouse steps, carried through the headlines, and carried into the hearts of everyone who had followed Elizabeth's story since the spring of 1990. And while the town exhaled a collective breath of relief, detectives were already preparing for what would come next, because the investigation was far from over, and the evidence inside that house was only beginning to speak. As the courthouse settled into its new rhythm, the real work began behind closed doors. Inside a secured evidence room, boxes marked State vs. Clean began to stack one after another. Each file, each photograph, each document told a piece of a story that prosecutors were determined to reconstruct, one that had stretched across 3 decades of silence. District Attorney Caroline Winters led the charge, her team working late nights, piecing together the fragments that would turn science into conviction. The DNA match had given them a powerful foundation, but Winters knew it was not enough on its own. They needed to show how Edward Allen Clean fit into Elizabeth's world, how his path crossed hers in those final moments of 1990. Investigators dug into his old delivery routes, Records showed that his beverage distribution line covered the area surrounding the park, where Elizabeth's belongings had been found. Co-workers from that era were located and interviewed, some recalling vague mentions of him making late deliveries near downtown, others remembering his abrupt transfer to Montgomery later that same year. A former supervisor confirmed that Clean had taken several unaccounted hours on the afternoon of May 8th. The date burned through the case file like a signature, Elizabeth's last known day alive. Witnesses were also re-interviewed, and one elderly neighbor recalled seeing a van idling near the Park Service Road that evening. The make and color matched the model used by Cleany's employer at the time. Piece by piece, the prosecution built a lattice of evidence connecting his movements, his proximity, and the unshakable DNA found on her backpack. By December 2021, after weeks of sealed testimony and forensic presentations, the grand jury reached its decision. Edward Allen Clean was formally indicted for kidnapping and first-degree murder. The announcement filled local headlines once again, but this time it was different. There was no speculation, no maybes, only certainty and resolve. The trial was set for May 2022, the 32nd anniversary of Elizabeth Kim's disappearance. For the first time in 32 years, a date was on the calendar that did not mark loss or sorrow. It marked the pursuit of justice that had waited a lifetime to stand in court. Yet beneath that moment of relief, everyone knew something. The truth of what had really happened to Elizabeth still lay buried, waiting for the day it would finally be spoken aloud. From the moment the hearings began, the front row of the courtroom was always reserved for the Kim family. Mary sat in the center, her posture upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. On her right sat Janet, now a mother herself, and on her left, Michael, who had flown in from California and rarely spoke during the sessions, his eyes fixed on the man at the defense table. Each appearance of Edward Allen Clean was a collision of decades. A reminder of everything the family had endured. He never turned to face them, not once, yet Mary said she could feel the weight of her presence pressing into the space between them. For her, it was not revenge, it was purpose. She wanted him to see the living echo of what he had destroyed, the family that refused to vanish like his silence. During one recess, a reporter asked Mary why she kept coming to every single hearing. She looked up and said softly that for 31 years she had woken up with one question: why? Now she wanted him to wake up with one answer. Her face, in that courtroom every day until justice spoke her daughter's name aloud. But even in those moments of strength, there was conflict inside her heart. She spoke later about the strange kind of relief she felt now that a name and a face existed behind the nightmare. She said it was like learning how to breathe again after years underwater, but realizing that the world above had changed while you were gone. For so long, being Elizabeth's mother had meant searching, hoping, fighting. Now that answers existed, Mary wondered who she was without the waiting. Janet held her mother's hand through most of the proceedings while Michael remained distant, quiet but unbroken. The siblings had found different ways to grieve, yet both had returned for this moment. Every hearing ended the same way, with the sound of the gavel, and the family standing together in the aisle, unmoving until the defendant was led away. And as spring approached, the air in the courthouse seemed to thicken, because after decades of questions, the truth everyone had feared and needed was finally about to be revealed. The trial of State versus Edward Allen Clean began in early May of 2022, 32 years after Elizabeth Kim vanished. The courtroom was silent as the opening statements began. Every seat filled, every camera pointed forward. For 3 long weeks, the story that had haunted a small Alabama town was finally told, piece by piece, voice by voice. 42 witnesses took the stand. Some were investigators from the earliest days. Others were scientists, analysts, and civilians who had unknowingly crossed paths with a man hiding in plain sight. The prosecution laid out more than 200 exhibits, Maps, delivery schedules, photos, DNA reports, all layered into a picture that left little room for coincidence. The defense tried to fight back, focusing not on innocence but on the fine print of process. Their argument centered on the chain of custody. They questioned whether the single strand of hair could have been contaminated, misplaced, or degraded during decades of storage. But each time the state's forensic experts countered with calm precision. Every sample had been sealed, logged, and preserved with care. Every step had been verified by modern retesting. Detective Eliza Sawyer testified for nearly a full day. Her voice stayed steady as she explained how the DNA match was verified beyond any reasonable doubt. She spoke of years of effort, and how one hair, one preserved fragment of truth, had carried Elizabeth's voice through time. On May 26th, the jury returned after only 4 hours of deliberation. The foreperson stood holding the verdict sheet. The judge asked for the decision, guilty, on all counts. Mary closed her eyes, tears falling silently as Janet placed a hand over hers. Across the aisle, Clean remained motionless, his expression blank, his eyes fixed on nothing. 2 weeks later came sentencing. The courtroom was quiet once again as the judge handed down life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words echoed softly, but their meaning thundered across the years. When the judge asked if the family wished to speak, Mary rose. Her voice was soft, but every word carried weight. She said she forgave him not for his sake, but for hers. She said she had carried darkness long enough, and that forgiveness was the only way she could ever see her daughter's memory in light again. Clean did not respond. He simply lowered his head as deputies led him away, vanishing through the side door in silence. The case that began on a quiet spring evening in 1990 had finally reached its end in that courtroom. But as the cameras dimmed and the crowd dispersed, one question still lingered. What became of Elizabeth in those lost hours that no one had ever seen? The conviction of Edward Allen Clean did more than bring closure to a single family. It changed the way an entire state approached justice. Within weeks of the verdict, law enforcement agencies from across Alabama began reaching out to Sheriff Marcus Wade's office, asking how his small 2-person cold case unit had done what decades of larger teams could not. Detective Eliza Sawyer and James Martinez became quiet symbols of what perseverance, science, and belief could achieve when time was no longer treated as an enemy. Their process, painstaking digitization, patient genealogy, and evidence preservation, became a model for others to follow. By the end of 2022, several counties had created their own dedicated cold case divisions, many operating from old storage rooms and unused offices, just like the one where Elizabeth's name had been pinned to the wall. What had once been a single spark in Cleburne County had now become a network of renewed purpose. The Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences took notice too. Working with the FBI, they established a statewide genetic genealogy support team, offering smaller jurisdictions access to cutting-edge technology that had once been out of reach. For the first time, investigators in even the smallest towns could trace DNA the way Eliza's team had done. At a press conference announcing the initiative, the state forensics director spoke with a mix of pride and gravity. He said this case had not just reopened one door, it had built a hallway through history. A bridge between the old way of waiting and the new way of finding. He paused for a moment, his voice softening as he added that Elizabeth Kim's story would now stand as a precedent, not only of loss, but of transformation. Because what began as a tragedy had rewritten the playbook for hope. And as reporters filed their stories that afternoon, one question remained quietly on every mind. After all these years, what became of the place where it all began? Years have passed since the verdict, and yet, if you walk down Pine Avenue on a quiet evening, you can still feel her story breathe through that place. The park where Elizabeth Kim took her last confirmed steps has changed. The city placed new benches, brighter lights, and a small memorial stone near the oak tree at the midpoint of the trail. Every May 8th, candles still flicker there. One for every year she was gone. One for every person who refused to forget. The white balloons that once rose into the Alabama sky have become a tradition across counties, carried by families who know what it means to wait for someone who never came home. Mary Kim still visits that park. She is older now, slower in her steps, but her eyes carry the same quiet strength that held her through the decades of not knowing. She says she comes not out of grief anymore, but gratitude. Gratitude that her daughter's name did not fade into rumor or dust. That truth, however long it took, still found its way home. Detective Eliza Sawyer keeps a photo of Elizabeth's senior portrait on her desk. She says she looks at it before every new case file, because this was more than just a solved mystery. It was proof that time cannot bury the truth when someone keeps digging for it. The house where Edward Clean once lived was sold years ago. The new owners say they felt uneasy at first, but later found peace knowing that justice had walked through that doorway before them. Life in Cleburne County has moved forward, though differently. Parents walk their children through that park holding hands a little tighter. Teenagers pass by the memorial and lower their voices. Everyone knows the story. Elizabeth Kim's name became a symbol of endurance, not just for her family, but for every community that has ever lost someone and refused to give up. And sometimes, just before sunset, the air over that park turns still, so quiet you could swear you hear a whisper in the wind. A reminder that even after 30 years of silence, truth still speaks. So if you are still watching this story right now, it means this one touched something inside you. That means it deserves your like and your subscribe. And do not forget to turn on the bell icon, because my mother set a challenge for this story. She said we must reach 5,000 likes. So help me reach that goal. It costs you nothing but means everything to me. And tell me, from which city are you watching this story tonight?